Chapter 5. The Human Contradiction. Instances where their behavior defied their own philosophy. In the living draft of Panta Rhei, the world is not a line but a breath between beginnings and endings that never quite end. Heraclitus teaches that everything flows, that conflict is not merely a disturbance but a principle, that the same fire that warms also consumes, that the logos orders flux even as it remains itself through change. Yet to observe a human being, a thinker, a reformer, a citizen, a lover of wisdom, is to watch a creature who often speaks in the present tense about a universe always becoming, while acting as if the verb were past and the subject immutable. The chapter you hold, then, surveys a countercurrent within that very current, the human contradiction. It asks not whether people can change, but how they reveal, in private and public, a stubborn insistence on stability, a selective fidelity to their creed, or a performative adherence that collapses the philosophy into its opposite. The matter is not a mere curiosity. It is a test of how a philosophy that foregrounds change negotiates the stubborn stubbornness of the self. Heraclitus would say that the world is in a state of perpetual motion, and that strife and opposition are the parents of harmony. But humans, in their ordinary days, tend to treat change as a principle for others or as a strategy for outcomes they desire, not as a condition of their own soul. We begin not with grand narrations of hypocrisy, but with small, intimate scenes, moments when a professed creed exposes a margin of inattention, when the river of life meets a bank of habit, and where the philosopher's own doctrine meets the stubborn, often comic, stubbornness of the human heart. 1. The skeptic who will not test his own skepticism. There exists in every village and in every academy a skeptic who loves the idea that doubt is a political virtue, a social posture, a method. He writes essays on the necessity of keeping beliefs in motion, on the danger of dogmatic certainty, on the virtue of remaining open to evidence. And yet, when the moment arrives to revise his own most central belief, the belief that his skepticism is not merely a tool but a constitutive stance, he stiffens. The mind that prides itself on asking questions, who flings a handful of questions at every tradition, suddenly finds the incoming answers unwelcome when they require changing a core position. What we observe is not a failure of reason so much as a failure of existential geometry. Change, to the Heraclitean mind, is a topology of being. One must bend with the current or risk being left on the shore. The skeptic, however, clings to a shoreline doctrine. The belief that doubt must remain unassuaged, that certainty is always a kind of danger, that truth moves in irregular rhythms that only he can detect. He risks becoming a paradox, a man who preaches Panta Rhei but refuses to step into the river that carries his own argument. He will announce the mutability of beliefs with fierce eloquence, only to defend his own belief in his own mutability with rhetorical stone walls whenever a contrary datum knocks at his door. Heraclitus would smile at the irony, then remind us that the logos is not a moral compass that always points toward generosity. It is the measure of flux that makes room for all things to pass, including the self that clings. The skeptic's rigidity, his stubborn insistence that his method must be preserved as an unassailable form of critique, exposes a deeper truth, one who wages perpetual doubt without allowing the possibility of a revised conclusion is, in the very act of doubting, creating a new fixed point. The river, thus, becomes a test not only of propositions but of the posture that believes it has transcended posture altogether. 2. The revolutionary who profits from inertia. There are those who imagine themselves heralds of change, the reformers, the utopians, the liberators, who speak with the feverish cadence of a crowd that has glimpsed a future. They insist that the order of the day is a failure to honor human potential, that the old institutions are impediments to life's forward surge. And their rhetoric, often luminous, sometimes blistering, coheres around a relentless thesis. Change is good, and constancy is a betrayal of life itself. Yet in the practice of governance, in the quiet of planning rooms, and in the rituals of power, the revolutionary can exhibit a curious paradox. The grand gestures toward new futures are not rarely accompanied by a cultivated taste for certain forms of stability. The new regime may require the same patterns of obedience, the same rituals of authority, the same channels of career advancement that the old regime demanded. The revolutionaries' inner circle can become a club, a protection racket of ideas, a system that rewards loyalty over inquiry and discipline over spontaneous dissent. A theory of constant becoming can paradoxically yield a social ecology of carefully managed stagnation. Here is a scene that reveals the contradiction with a quiet, almost tragic humor. A reformist leader proclaims that power must be exercised with transparency and that political life should be a theater of public reason. The rhetoric is clear. The people deserve to see the machinery of decision at work. The system must be open to dissent. The path to progress is a map that everyone can read. Yet in the actual habit of governance, a different logic often prevails. Meetings run in closed circles. Dissent is filtered through a narrow corridor of permissible questions, and the final decisions look suspiciously like the outcomes that were anticipated by the campaign's most trusted aides. The revolution's rhetoric promises a river that carries all boats, but the current often flows toward a channel where the boats that are not closely tied to the leadership do not find a ride. Heraclitus would note that even the most dynamic philosophies risk becoming static when they forget that the river's desirably dislodging power is not simply in changing policies, but in unsettling the self that celebrates its own change. The revolutionary who refuses to budge from his own preconditions, who demands that every critique be folded into a favorable interpretation of the plan, exposes a hidden conservatism, a belief that change is valuable only when it serves a carefully curated vision of the future. In that moment, the doctrine of perpetual motion becomes a doctrine of perpetual administration. The city speaks of flux, its leaders perform permanence. 3. The pacifist who arms the dream. Heraclitus did not preach pacifism by negation, but by understanding that conflict is the seabed of life. The pacifist, in a public face, embodies a near-sacred commitment to nonviolence, to oppose war, to oppose violence, to maintain a foothold in a world that seems bent toward strife. The moral energy behind such a stance is admirable, and it accords with the intuition that we are all part of the same living river, that harm to others boomerangs back upon ourselves. But there is a stubborn and revealing contradiction that can emerge within pacifist rhetoric when it encounters political necessity, perceived danger, or the logic of self-preservation. A pacifist state may demur from violence while its security apparatus grows as a parallel sculpture, an arsenal as indispensable as the memory of a state's wrongs. The philosopher may preach restraint in word and in law, yet orders or condones actions whose violence exceeds the bounds of the moral stance in the name of peace. A leader who proclaims that war is a failure of human virtue can justify, by reason of necessity, the very acts they condemn in others. The city's minds, if not the city's hands, learn to live in the paradox that to deter war by violence is a paradox the public often grants, with a shrug, as a necessary compromise. Heraclitus thought, with its insistence on the unity of opposites, would describe this as a familiar irony. The same instrument that preserves peace can also become the instrument that threatens it, when wielded by those who claim to be its guardians. The piano music of a society's ethics, soft, deliberate, and harmonious, must sometimes strike a dissonant chord to prevent a greater dissonance. The pacifist who arms the dream reveals a core truth. Priorities formed in isolation from the world's pressure can produce a plan that, in its execution, contradicts its own moral ground. The river of intention runs alongside the river of consequence, and the two often refuse to be identical. 4. The scientist who seeks open access, then gatekeeps publication. Science is the road that Heraclitus would call open to continual revision. The scientist who believes in falsifiability, that knowledge advances by being wrong, and that each experiment is a node in a broader movement toward closer approximations to truth, embodies one of the most luminous embodiments of Panta Rhei. Yet the human actor in any science, the lab head, the grant committee, the department chair, may exhibit a curious inconsistency. They champion openness in theory, but practice a form of gatekeeping that protects a prestige economy. Certain ideas receive a hearing, while others are dismissed, not strictly on empirical merit, but on social capital or fear of controversy. There is a case in which a theorist preaches methodological humility while maintaining a personal inertia against revising a deeply held model in the light of new data. When data arrive that challenge a cherished theory, the usual Heraclitean response would be to integrate the anomaly, to let it modify the framework, to observe how the system's order can accommodate new tensions. The human actor, however, sometimes responds with a different logic. He rebuilds the wall around his theory, tightens the peer review gate, expands the list of required citations, or reframes the data as an exception rather than a phenomenon. The reason often lies less in malice than in fear. Fear that to alter the master narrative is to surrender a part of one's professional identity. Fear that the river of one's career will be diverted into new channels and, perhaps, away from the familiar banks that have given safety and status. Heraclitus would remind us that the same fire that illuminates can burn, that the mind that clings to a single shape of truth risks becoming a fossil in a world whose law is flux. The scientist who clings to a theory because it has generated prestige is not merely a hypocrite. He is a listener who has forgotten that listening is the first act of knowledge, and that listening often requires letting go of what one thought one owned. The moral of this contradiction is not that science should abandon structure or theory, but that the life of inquiry demands a constant willingness to be wrong, or at least to be changed by the wrongness we encounter. 5. The artist who chases freedom, then schedules spontaneity. Artists are the most visible friends of change. Their vocation is to inhabit the liminal space where life slips out of the ordinary and becomes art, where the accidental becomes meaningful, where habit dissolves into perception, where the idea of freedom becomes a practice rather than a slogan. Yet even artists who preach spontaneity sometimes build the most rigid discipline into their daily routines. The orbit of inspiration, they declare, is a wild wind that cannot be captured, and yet their working life may look like a meticulously charted ritual, a studio routine, a ritual of tea, a set sequence of experiments in color, line, or sound. They insist that their art is born not of total control, but of total openness. Yet the act of anticipating the moment of inspiration, the ritual of waiting, the precise moment when inspiration might strike, often becomes a method as controlling as any technique. In such a paradox, the artist's creed of freedom collides with the human need for structure. The same person who writes about the dissolving borders between form and meaning can become attached to a preferred set of tools, a trusted palette, a familiar tempo, and a particular order of days. The result is not the collapse of art into rigidity, but a paradox. Spontaneity is pursued with the same seriousness that a monk gives to a vow, so that the unplanned itself becomes a plan. Heraclitus would see in this a microcosm of the larger truth. To be truly in flux is to recognize the fragility of the self's plans, as well as the beauty of a plan that admits it does not own the moment. The artist who cannot bear the idea of a blank canvas, who insists that the moment must be captured on a predefined schedule, undermines the very energy that makes painting or music possible. The difference between high art and its counterfeit is the willingness to let the river rewrite the page while the page remains in sight. 6. The religious leader who condemns wealth yet lives in abundance. Religion often speaks in the idiom of renunciation, of detachment from the world's possessions as preparation for a higher life. The spiritual voice can be a lighthouse, calling followers to see beyond accumulation, to recognize that true wealth resides in perception, virtue, and the serenity of inner life. But the human actor, sometimes a religious leader or a spiritual entrepreneur, can reveal a more tenacious contradiction, the assertion of a detachment that the life of power and prestige can meet without internal conversion. They condemn attachment in their sermons while enjoying a lavish standard of living that few can reach without instrumental power, political protection, or cultural authority. The rhetoric of poverty becomes the banner for possession, the banner of asceticism the cover for ostentation. Here the Heraclitean insight about unity through opposition is especially poignant. The same talk that decries the love of wealth can be funded by wealth. The same voice that preaches simplicity can be hosted in a palace of ceremonial grandeur. The public is invited to witness a drama, moral exhortations that are not matched by daily practice. The contradiction is not only about ethics. It is about the perception of truth as a performative tool. The religious leader who preaches non-attachment but then negotiates a vision of faith that requires dividends or real estate to function, dramatizes a common human tension, the desire to be seen as principled while enjoying the benefits of power. Heraclitus would at once shrug at the contradiction and invite us to see in it the way human beings test what they claim to care about. The river's current can carry both the sermon and the sanctum. The question is whether they bend toward the same horizon or diverge. 7. The family life that tests philosophy against tenderness. If public figures provide the most dramatic arenas, the intimate sphere offers perhaps the most stubborn contradiction. A person may profess a philosophy rooted in compassion, humility, and the constant reformation of the self when faced with the grief, illness, or fatigue of daily life. Yet in the small hours, when a child wakes with a fever, when a partner asks for patience, when the checkbook balances with a sigh of fear, the philosophy that once seemed like compass becomes a memory, and the reflexes of old habits, irritation, pride, avoidance, withdrawal, reassert themselves. The most intimate tests of Panta Rei do not require grand rhetoric, but fidelity in the ordinary, the day-to-day choices that reveal what one loves, what one fears, and what one is truly willing to change. In these moments, the contradiction is not a moral failing but a human possibility, the reminder that the river runs through the home as well as through the street. A husband who preaches forgiveness but nourishes resentment in small, unspoken forms. A wife who insists that life is a gift and then denies her own vulnerabilities to the ones she most cares about. A parent who extols flexibility but enforces a strict routine that leaves little room for the unpredictable weather of a child's needs. These ordinary patterns show that even the most enlightened theories must contend with the stubborn weather of affection, memory, and fatigue. Heraclitus's message is not that such contradictions annihilate virtue. Rather, they reveal its continuous refitting, its insistence on being negotiated anew in each moment. 8. The conductor of a city who loves the idea of a living order but cannot tolerate the living people who disturb it. Cities, like rivers, are not simply scenes but experiments in flux. The planner who imagines a perfectly legible order, the grid, the zoning, the predictable flows of traffic, can become, without meaning to, the person who makes life uninhabitable for those whose needs do not align with the plan. A city may praise diversity and encourage the mixing of cultures, then impose rules that accidentally legislate the suppression of the very behavior that would fulfill the promise of that diversity. The philosopher who loves the word Panta Rei may nonetheless look around and sigh at the dissonant disobedience of the crowd, insisting that the fault lies with the people rather than with a plan that refuses to adapt to their living habits, their rhythms, their crises. The contradiction here is structural. To claim to love flux while seeking to materialize permanence invites the irony of a system that cannot breathe. Heraclitus' own river becomes a metaphor for urban life, uncontainable in its breadth, always changing its banks, always requiring new roads, new insights, new ways of listening to the hum of the city. The person who values adaptability yet clings to outdated models, traffic rules that punish the slower rider while simultaneously claiming to honor mobility, disaster preparedness that forecasts every possible threat yet cannot adapt to an unforeseen moment, embodies a common, stubborn error of mind. It is not that change should be dispensed with. It is that the human instrument for guiding change often betrays its own philosophy by treating change as a fearsome risk rather than as the life of the project. Conclusion: the paradox as pedagogy and the practice of living in Panta Rei. What unites these vignettes, skeptic, revolutionary, pacifist, scientist, artist, religious leader, family member, urban planner, is not a simple accusation of hypocrisy, but a more nuanced invitation. The Heraclitean vision does not scold the contradictions in others as if they proved a moral failure, nor does it pretend that change is a painless, uniform experience. Instead, it asks us to notice the seams where thought meets life, the places where a creed has to cross the border into living. The river requires not only a current, but also an eye to the banks. The flame requires not only warmth, but a recognition that warmth and burn are two faces of the same phenomenon. In this sense, human contradictions become among the most instructive teachers of Panta Rei. They reveal that the philosophy of flux is not merely a metaphysical claim, but a mode of moral attention, a discipline of noticing, naming, and negotiating the tensions between what one says and how one acts. They remind us that the self is a site where the river's motion congeals into decisions and habits. They make plain that change is not a universal cure for moral error, but a constant field of engagement with one's own limits. So how might a reader inhabit the teaching of Heraclitus within a life of contradiction? By cultivating a practice of quiet, continuous attention. By learning to recognize the moment when one's argument about change becomes a barrier to change in one's own life. By inviting humility into the daily practice of living. To own one's mistakes. To revise one's judgments with the same ease with which one would revise a theory in light of new evidence. And to do so without withdrawing love for the world that remains in flux. This is not the triumph of skepticism over belief, nor the triumph of belief over doubt. It is the uneasy coexistence, the bigger, more stubborn truth, that life in flux requires. That we are, at once, the river and the shore, the flame and the ember, the agent of change and the witness to change, forever learning how to love what is changing in us as much as what is changing around us. For Heraclitus, the logos binds the whole by a law that cannot be known in full by any single mind, yet can be glimpsed in the courage to stay with the tension. The human contradiction, then, is not a blemish on the face of philosophy. It is the living test of it. If we are to inhabit the portrait of the philosopher who might have authored the phrase Panta Rhei, we must acknowledge that every claim to knowing the river's course is also a claim to control a current that defies control. The best we can do is to become more alert to our own inconsistencies, more generous about the times we adjust, and more fearless in letting our lives, as best we can, be the figures of a life lived in flux. The road up and the road down are the same road, Heraclitus reminds us. And so is the path toward wisdom, not a straight ascent toward a fixed summit, but a revolving circle that recognizes the rise and fall of every claim, every creed, every moment of being sure we know what change is, and when we must learn again what it is to be human within that change. In studying the human contradiction, we study not only the limits of philosophy, but the breadth of life, and in the breadth we glimpse the enduring truth, that to live under the sign of Panta Rhei is to learn anew, in every scene, what it means to be a being who changes and who remains at once.